There is a drug in your Christmas box. You probably ate some of it last December, wrapped in gold foil, shaped like a little fruit or a smooth pale loaf. It is just sweet almond candy. At least that is what you think it is, because for most of its life, the soft almond paste we call marzipan was not a treat at all. It was a prescription. You did not buy it at a bakery. You bought it from an apothecary, the closest thing the medieval world had to a pharmacy, and you ate it because a physician told you it would make you well. Today, a single company in the German city of Lübeck turns out around 30 tons of the stuff a day in the run-up to Christmas. 30 tons of a former medicine. This is the story of how a drug quietly became a dessert, and how almost nobody noticed the moment it changed. It was the 9th century, and a Persian physician was writing down nearly everything the medical world of his time believed it knew. His name was Al-Razi. In Europe they would later call him Rhazes, and he was one of the sharpest medical minds of the entire medieval period. Somewhere in his vast catalogue of remedies, he praised a simple mixture: ground sweet almonds, bound together with sugar. To him this was not a snack, it was a treatment, something to restore a weak body and steady a troubled mind. That is one of the earliest written traces we have of the thing that would become marzipan, and it does not appear in a recipe book. It appears in a book about healing. To understand why a paste of almonds and sugar could be taken seriously as medicine, you have to throw out almost everything you assume about both ingredients. Start with the sugar. We think of sugar as the opposite of health, a cheap everywhere thing that rots teeth and pads waistlines. In the medieval world it was none of that. Sugar was rare, it was imported from far away at enormous cost, and it was classified, quite literally, as a drug. Physicians working from the old theory of the four humours believed sugar was warm and moist in nature, gentle on the body, and useful for balancing someone who had fallen ill. Apothecaries kept it locked up beside their other precious compounds. There was even an old saying that described someone fully stocked and ready for anything, like an apothecary without sugar, meaning a man who had nothing at all. And here is the part that sounds invented but is not. For a long stretch of the Middle Ages, in many European towns, only apothecaries were legally allowed to trade in sugar and the expensive spices that travelled with it. If you wondered how a sweet shop could possibly be against the rules, so did plenty of people at the time. Sugar was not groceries. Sugar was pharmacy. Now add the almonds. Almonds were prized as nourishing and easy on the stomach, the kind of food you gave to someone too sick to manage anything heavier. Grind them fine, sweeten them with the most prized medicine on the apothecary's shelf, and you have created something that, by the logic of the age, was doubly healing. A restorative you could hold in your hand. Apothecaries shaped and sold exactly that, and physicians recommended it for everything from physical weakness to disorders of the mind. This was not unusual for the time. It was the whole model. Walk into a medieval or early modern apothecary, and a startling amount of what sat on the shelves was sweet. There were hard sugar lozenges called Manus Christi, the hand of Christ, sometimes flecked with gold or pearl, taken not to cure a sickness but to hold one off. There was candied citrus peel, sugared spices, and yes, marzipan. The recipes for these things were written down in medical manuscripts, not in cookery books, because that is what they were understood to be: treatments. When King Henry VIII's apothecary listed his stores, sweets like these sat right there among the official medicines of the crown. So what was marzipan actually for? By the medicine of the day, a great deal. The almond paste and its sugary cousins were thought to rebuild a body wasted by illness, to settle a sour stomach, to comfort the chest, and even to lift a heavy, grieving mind. Sweetness itself was read as a kind of gentleness the body could use. Sugar was reached for much the way we now reach for a tonic, prescribed to help a patient recover their strength rather than to cure one named disease. So when a physician sent soft almond paste to a sickbed, he was not being soft-hearted. He was, by every rule he had been taught, simply doing his job. So for a moment, picture the real thing. A wealthy household in the 14th or 15th century. Someone is unwell, run down, frightened. And the remedy that arrives is not a bitter draught. It is a pale, fragrant almond paste, soft and sweet, handed over by a man in the most trusted trade in town. That was Marzipan's first life. But a medicine made from the two most expensive things an apothecary owned was never going to belong to ordinary people. And that single fact is what sent Marzipan down a very strange road. Because if almonds were costly, sugar was the real fortune. Think about where it had to come from. Sugarcane did not grow in northern Europe. The sugar that reached a counter in London or Lübeck had been hauled from the warm edges of the Mediterranean and beyond, from places like Cyprus and the Levant, carried home in part by returning crusaders, and then funneled through the merchant cities of Italy. By the 15th century, Venice held a near stranglehold on refining and selling it. People called sugar white gold, and they were not being poetic. In the city of London in the year 1309, a single pound of it could cost about what an ordinary worker earned in wages over a long stretch of labour. 1 pound of sugar, real money. So a confection built almost entirely from sugar, and almonds was, in plain terms, edible money. It was not something a peasant family would ever taste. It was a thing for kings, for bishops, for the kind of household that measured its wealth in ships. And because sugar was understood as a medicine, the costliest one on the shelf, this is the logic that made marzipan make perfect sense. The most expensive substance in the country, bound up with a nourishing nut, and handed to you exactly when you were at your weakest. Of course it was a drug. Only the powerful could afford to be healed this way. And the rich did not just take marzipan as medicine, they began to show it off. This is the moment the story turns, because the price tag that kept marzipan out of common hands made it irresistible to people who wanted to display exactly how much they could afford to waste. While marzipan was still officially a remedy, the great courts of Europe were quietly turning it into theatre. At the grandest feasts, the meal did not end with the last savoury dish. It ended with a separate course of sweets, and the centrepiece of that course could be a sculpture. Not a sculpture of stone or sugar glass, a sculpture of marzipan. Cooks and confectioners learned that the stiff almond paste could be moulded and coloured and gilded into almost anything. Castles with little marzipan towers, animals, coats of arms, entire edible scenes, built to be admired, then eaten. The most famous example comes from England. In 1527, Cardinal Wolsey threw a feast for the French ambassadors, and by the accounts that survive, the sweet course alone carried more than 100 of these sculptures. There were sugar castles, a model of St. Paul's Cathedral with its steeple, animals and birds, and tiny human figures fighting with swords and crossbows, dancing and jousting, all of it shaped from sugar paste and almond. And many of those pieces were never meant to be eaten at all. They were carried in, set down, admired for the evening, then cleared away. A single churchman could commission an entire cathedral built from the most expensive substance in the country, purely so his guests could look at it over dinner. That was the spectacle. The eating was almost beside the point. On paper, this was still a medicine. Europe's richest men were building monuments out of the apothecary's shelf. In England, this hardened showpiece version even had its own name. They called it Marchpane. And it was not a minor flourish. In a famous household manual from 1615, the writer Gervase Markham instructed that the marchpane should have, in his words, the first place, the middle place, and the last place at a banquet. Think about that for a second. A former medicine was now the single most important object on the most important table in the house. It opened the show, It anchored the middle and it closed the night. You can even hear an echo of this world in Shakespeare. In Romeo and Juliet, in the rush before the Capulet feast, a servant is hoping to sneak away a piece of marchpane. The almond paste that began on an apothecary's shelf as a treatment for the sick had become the thing the servants stole bites of at a party. The same two ingredients, a completely different meaning. And the royal courts were not the only place this was happening. Behind the walls of convents across southern Europe, nuns were turning the same almond paste into small miracles of their own. In the Sicilian city of Palermo, the sisters of a convent known as the Martorana became famous for it. As the story is told, ahead of a visit from an important churchman with their garden bare in the late autumn, the nuns shaped marzipan into perfect little fruits, lemons and oranges and figs, painted so cleverly you would swear they had just been picked off a branch. Fruta martorana, those fruits are still called, and Sicilians still make them. To this day they belong to the 1st of November, the Feast of All Saints. Spain has its own version, centred on the old city of Toledo, where convent kitchens turned out marzipan so prized that the city is still known for it today. And here something interesting happens, the kind of detail that should make you raise an eyebrow. The Toledo tradition comes wrapped in a familiar tale. After a great battle and the famine that followed it, the story says, the city had no bread, but it did have almonds and sugar, so the nuns ground them into a paste and fed the starving. Hold on to the shape of that story. You are going to hear it again. So how does something this exclusive, this loaded with status, end up as the cheapest item at the Christmas market? Two things had to happen at once, and they happened slowly enough that nobody alive felt the ground move under them. The first was about who was allowed to make it. For centuries, the apothecaries had guarded sugar as their own. But as the love of sweets spread, a new trade pushed its way into existence. Confectioners, sometimes called canditors, won the right to work sugar themselves, outside the apothecary's monopoly. The moment that happened, marzipan had somewhere new to live. It was no longer locked behind a counter of medicines. It could sit in a sweet shop window, sold by someone whose only job was delight. The second thing was bigger, and it was about the price of sugar itself. Across the early modern centuries, sugar stopped being a rare imported wonder and became a flood. New sugar, grown on plantations far across the Atlantic, arrived in volumes the medieval apothecary could never have imagined. The trickle that had once cost a working man his wages turned into a tide. As it poured into Europe in ever greater quantities, the price fell, and then it kept falling. The single most expensive ingredient in marzipan, the thing that had made it a drug for the wealthy, slowly turned into the cheapest thing in any kitchen. And once sugar was cheap, the spell broke. A confection that had been priceless became eventually ordinary. This is where one of the most beloved origin stories in all of food gets told, and here is that familiar shape again, which is the very reason you should handle it with care. The city of Lübeck on Germany's Baltic coast claims that in the year 1407, during a terrible famine, the city's stores were searched for anything edible. In one old forgotten warehouse, the story goes, the searchers found great quantities of almonds and honey, and the bakers used them to make a bread that kept the city alive. Bread of famine, some versions call it. The trouble is that the dates and the details do not hold up well, and historians treat it as a charming myth rather than a record. What is true is that Lübeck became and remains the most famous marzipan city on earth, home to a confectioner named Niederegger, who built an empire on it in the early 1800s. And Lübeck was not even alone. Further east, the Prussian city of Königsberg grew a rival marzipan tradition in the same era, baking the surface of its sweets until they turned a deep golden brown, a style its confectioners carried away with them when the city itself was erased from the German map after the Second World War. Now step back and look at the whole pattern. The same almond paste. The same famine legend told of more than one town, Toledo and Lübeck both. The same scattered cities all insisting they were the ones who invented it. That is not how a single recipe behaves. That is how something genuinely old and shared behaves. Something that belonged to the entire medieval world long before any one city carved its name into it. And that brings us back to where we started, to the gold foil and the Christmas box, because the recipe never really left. Strip away the centuries and marzipan is still the Apothecaries formula, almost unchanged. Ground sweet almonds and sugar. That is it. The strict German standard for the finest Lübeck marzipan even caps how much sugar it is allowed to contain, somewhere around a third by weight at most, because the prestige is in the almonds, exactly as it was when Al-Razi praised the mixture more than 1,000 years ago. When that Lübeck factory runs flat out before Christmas, processing tons of almonds at a time with hundreds of seasonal workers, and earns around half its entire yearly income in those few December weeks, it is mass-producing a medieval prescription and selling it as a holiday treat. That is the kind of number that makes you stop and look at the thing on your plate. And the best part is how little stands between you and the original. This is one of the few medieval luxuries you can recreate almost perfectly at home, because there were only ever two real ingredients. Take blanched almonds, the skins slipped off, and grind them as fine as you can manage. Work in sugar and a small amount of moisture to bring it together, traditionally rose water, which is exactly the kind of fragrant touch a medieval apothecary would have reached for. Knead it into a smooth paste. That is marzipan. No special equipment, no secret. The one thing that truly matters is the ratio, and this is where most modern marzipan quietly betrays its own history. The cheap stuff crowding the supermarket shelf is mostly sugar with a whisper of almond, which is exactly backwards from the way the apothecaries thought. To them, the almond was the medicine and the sugar was the helper. The good version, the version actually worth eating, leans hard on the almonds and lets the sugar play the smaller part. Get more almond than sugar into your bowl, and you have already beaten almost everything sold in a wrapper today. You can roll it, colour it, mould it into the little fruits the Sicilian nuns made, or press it into the showpiece the lords of Europe once paid fortunes for. What you will be holding is not a modern candy at all. It is the apothecary's restorative, the banquet's centrepiece, the bread that supposedly saved a city, all in one soft almond loaf. So the next time someone hands you a piece of marzipan and you think quietly that you have never really liked the stuff, remember what you are turning down. For 1,000 years this was medicine for the sick, a fortune for the rich, and the proudest object on the table. The candy is the disguise. The drug was the truth. We dig up the history hiding in plain sight, so subscribe. What surprised you most? That doctors prescribed it, that it cost a fortune, or that you have eaten it for years?